Hi guys, and welcome to U-Wrench. Today we're working on the Grand Caravan, the 2008 through 2020 model. Same also applies for the Chrysler Town Country. And today we're going to be doing a full brake rotor and pad change. Let's take a look. So if you've not done it before, then the thought of working on the brakes on your own car can be a little bit daunting. This is something not to be afraid of. The brake system on cars is generally quite a simple one, and so it's quite hard to actually go wrong when you do this. All you need is to take your time, use a little bit of common sense as you go, just follow through the video and you'll be absolutely fine. And of course, if this is something you're doing regularly, servicing the brakes on your own vehicles, then over time you're going to be saving yourself a lot of money as well. And it's also very rewarding to know that you've done the work yourself. So let's get it done. So next up, grab yourself the longest wrench that you have available, or a breaker bar if you have one, and also a size 19 socket, because that's what you need for the nuts here on the Grand Caravan. And what we're going to do at this stage, before you jack the car up, is you're just going to slacken these nuts off. So you're not trying to remove them at this stage, you're just literally, simple as that, just taking taking a little bit off, because if you leave them fully tightened, when you raise the wheel off of the ground, you try and doing these and the whole wheel will just turn. So you just want to slacken these off so that when we take the weight off of the wheel, it'll be easier to remove these nuts. So go ahead and do all 5. So next you want to make sure that your handbrake is definitely engaged, and then we're going to jack up the corner that you're working on, and we're going to get the wheel removed. So a quick tip when working on the front brakes, the bolts that we're going to need to access are actually on the rear of the caliper assembly, and so they can be quite tricky to get at. So what you can do, depending on how you're working on your vehicle, you can actually turn your steering wheel, and this will mean that the whole hub will turn out in this direction, which means the caliper will come out in this direction, and that will allow much easier access to the fixings on the rear. However, it's only really suitable to do that if you've jacked up both sides of the car. Ideally, if you're using axle stands and you've jacked up the entire front of the car and you've got axle stands in there, then this is an ideal time to do this. Makes working on these a little bit easier. If you've only jacked it up on one side, you've got to be a little bit careful, because remember the wheel on the opposite side of the car is obviously going to be sat on the floor, and as you start to steer, it will start to pull the whole car in that direction, which will put strain on the jack down in this corner. So you've got to be very careful. It is possible to do, but I wouldn't recommend it. But if you're working on axle stands or you've jacked up both sides of your car, this is a great tip. Okay, so here we have the basic caliper assembly. This is the main caliper here, and the caliper bolts through into this section here, which is called a carrier, also known as a caliper bracket, and that's what actually holds the pads in place. So looking at the rear on this type of brake setup here, you can see we've got these bolts top and bottom, just here and again at the bottom there. And these actually bolt through on slider pins. They bolt through the caliper and go through into the carrier there. And in addition to that, so that's what you need to remove to be able to remove your brake pad, but to also be able to remove the brake rotor, it's usually the case that you have to remove your carrier. And as you can see, you've got these bigger bolts, and again there's one on the top, and I don't know whether you'll be able to see that down there. But there's one down at the bottom there as well, and those are what hold the actual carrier or the caliper bracket onto the hub, and that's usually removed to allow you to remove your brake rotor. So that's the basic setup and kind of how it works. As you can see on our vehicle, the brakes have had their fair bit of use. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab a penetration fluid. This is the one that we use here called Plus Gas, but there's dozens of different penetration fluids available on the market. And if you haven't got a dedicated one, WD-40, although it's not the best, does a reasonably good job of this. So what you want to do is before you start, if you've got it available, just put a little bit of the penetration fluid just on these fixings, top and bottom. And what that will do is that will soak in, and that will actually make it a little bit easier, and same with the bolts here for your carriers. Again, I'll do the bottom one as well in a second, and just give that 5 minutes or so. And what that does, actually soaks into and tries to get work its way down, kind of into the thread, get in as deep as it can. And very often that can be the difference between being able to get a stubborn bolt removed or it being stuck fast. So penetration fluid, or if you're stuck, WD-40 is well worth giving that a 5-minute blast before you get stuck in. So what we're going to be doing first is we're going to be releasing the bolt that passes through the caliper through into the carrier. On the DODGE Grand Caravan that we're working on today, this is a 1/2 inch. Just get yourself a 1/2 inch socket. Make sure that's on there nice and deep, and then grab your wrench and we'll get to work on that now. One thing to note when you start to loosen this off is you can see there's a second nut just the other side of it, just in here. And what you may find is when you start to turn this, this will start to turn as well. If that's the case, you'll have to get a second spanner and just manually hold that on there with the spanner in that position whilst you use the wrench on this side. That's if that starts to turn. What you'll find is very often that they're on so tight that this won't actually turn until this is quite slack, and so you can undo it by your fingers anyway. But if it does start to twist, just remember, grab yourself the suitable size spanner, slot that in there, and that'll allow you to carry on. Another quick tip for you, if you're struggling to get the socket on, there's probably a little bit of a build-up of crud on there. So what you can do is just grab yourself a wire brush, and just give that a clean down, and then you should find it then much easier once that's cleaned and all the bits of dirt have gone to get the socket in place. So to enable you to remove the bottom bolt, you may find, this one's starting to move, as you can see. So what we're going to do is just stop that moving temporarily. So I'm just going to put that back in, a couple of screws by hand, and then I can then start to attack the bottom one. There we go. Now I can safely get both of them removed. So we're now ready to remove the caliper. So if you start to move it, this one's going to be okay. So you can see this is going to slide its way off slowly by wiggling it. This will come off of the brake pads, no problem. If you get it so it's really stuck and you're really struggling to get it off, what you can do is just push the piston slightly back into the caliper. The way to do this is just to find a leverage point where you can lever somewhere in with the brake disc here. This is quite easy, we've got vented ones here, against the body of the caliper. And you only want to do it literally just a millimetre or so, just to allow it just to free up just a little bit, and that should make it a lot easier to slide that off. So now you've got your caliper removed. What you don't want to do is just leave it to hang, because the reason is it will be hanging on the flexi hose, and you really don't want to damage that. So what you want to do is, using a piece of string or a bungee cord or some cable ties, find a suitable point to temporarily hold it in position. So what I'm going to do, I've got a little hole on the top, just here. That'll be an ideal point for me to mount this. Going to carefully let that hang in that position there. So next stage is we want to get the old brake pads out of the way. Now, as we can see here, there is no meat left on these pads at all. This is some of the worst pads I've seen. There's virtually nothing left on them. What you want to do is just get it depends how hard they are to lever out. Sometimes you can do it with your fingers. If you can't, just gently get a flathead screwdriver and start to lever the ends out. As you can see, these aren't coming out very easily. We've got quite a big build-up of dirt and grime by the looks of it. So just keep working them. There we go. And eventually the pad will come out. Like I said, that is virtually completely gone. That's one of the worst I've seen. Hopefully your brake pads won't have been run that thin, but that's all you need to do. So repeat it on the second one just here. So taking a look at your brake pad, you'll see on one of them it'll have this kind of a metal looped over section that comes and passes through, and usually this is set at a certain distance that is the kind of the official wear marker for the pad. And the reason being is as soon as your pad material wears down and it hits the tip of this, that's when it will start to make your squeaking noise. So when your brakes are starting to squeak, this is a representation obviously that the pads are getting low and should be changed. So that's what this section is for right here. So next up we're going to be removing the carrier. Once the carrier's off, the disc will be free to move. So what we're going to do is we don't want this heavy disc falling off, landing on our feet or on our hands, whatever we're working on. So we can get one of the old wheel nuts. I'm just going to put that on like so. And basically that will just stop that disc being able to physically fall off of that car, so that's just for safety. So next up we've got these two big bolts, top and bottom for the carrier. On the Dodge Caravan, Grand Caravan, they are 13/16 of an inch, so grab the correct one, and again the longest wrench you have, ideally a breaker bar, and we'll get to work on these. So again, as before, just put the first one you've slackened off, leave that in place to allow you to work on the second one. Otherwise, the whole bracket might start to move. So now we're ready to remove the old rotor from the car. Some are easy, this one's not going to be. This one's obviously got a little bit of rust between the hub and the back of the disc. So we're going to grab a hammer and give this a light tap to convince it to come off. So grab yourself a suitable hammer, and it's going to give this a few taps just to break the seal between the back of the disc and the hub. Now, as you hit it, you may need to turn it around so you can keep hitting it in a slightly different place. If you can't move it by hand, which I can't quite, you can always just put your breaker bar in, and that'll help you get the extra leverage that you like, just placing it between the two nuts if you've got this type of fixing. So as you saw, this disc was a real struggle to get off. What we'll do is when we refit, I'll give you some tips on how we can avoid this using some copper anti-seize. You shouldn't have to work that hard to get your old disc off. Unfortunately we did, but we'll avoid that in the future. So we now have everything removed, and before we refit the new rotor, what we're going to do is we're going to give this, the face of your hub a bit of a clean up using the wire brush, just to ensure that any kind of old corrosion or anything is removed, and we get this nice and flat, ready for the new rotor to be fitted. When you do this, remember you should wear both eye protection and a safety mask as well. So once we've given this a bit of a clean up, the other thing you can do is grab yourself some brake cleaner, doesn't matter on the brand, and we're going to spray a little bit of this off on here and give it a bit of a wipe off. Be careful not to spray it directly into the centre, into your wheel bearing here, just around the edges, and give that a good wipe off, and that should get these really nice and clean. So we want to prevent the new rotors from sticking to the hub. Therefore getting around the problem that we've just had to experience, which was a bit of a nightmare getting these off. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply a thin layer of grease to the face of the hub here. So that layer of grease will sit between the hub and the brake disc, and that should stop them sticking together again in the future. A couple of products you can use for this. This is just standard copper anti-seize or copper grease. and this is very good for kind of general work on brakes. In more recent years, it's kind of a slightly old-fashioned product. In more recent years, it's been kind of updated and replaced with dedicated brake grease products such as this, which we will be using later in the video. But for doing things like facings like this, I still prefer to use the copper anti-seize. In theory, you could use either. So we're going to apply a thin layer just the front of this before we fit the new rotor. So make sure you also go around the kind of this lip of the wheel bearing right here, because that feeds up inside the brake rotor. And you can see I'm actually using a small brush to apply this. I prefer to use a brush rather than my hands because very soon I'm going to be working with the rotors and the pads, and you do not want to start getting grease, especially on the pads, because they're actually slightly absorbent, and you really don't want to soak any grease into the faces of those pads. So better to use a brush, or if you're going to use your hands, be sure to change your gloves before you then handle the rotors and the pads. So now you want to grab your brand new rotor. It's a good idea just to flatten out the box. Just going to use that in a second. Now what you'll notice is that new rotors, they obviously come in an airtight package, and in there they actually put a very thin layer of oil all over the facings of the disc, and so we have to remove that before we fit it to the car. So obviously we don't want to be rubbing oil into the faces of our brand new brake pads, so we can use our brake cleaner to give this a good clean. So let's get these open. So grab the brake cleaner, and we're just going to give these a bit of a spray and give them a really good wipe off. You want to get rid of all of the grease from the faces of these discs. So now we're going to flip it over and do the other side. Obviously we've put a little bit of grease on this cardboard here. So what I'll do, just use the other bit of cardboard and repeat the process. Okay, so grab a wheel nut as before, so when we put the new rotor on, we don't want it to accidentally fall off. So next, taking a quick look at the new pads. Ideally, when you buy your new pads, what you want to do is ensure that they come with a new set of shims, just like these ones. And what these are these little metal guides. So you see they're quite old and dirty, but here in the carrier, we've got two on either side there. So that's exactly what these little shims are. Now, if you don't, if your new set didn't come with them for any reason, you can get your some brake cleaner and your wire brush, and you can clean these up, and usually do an okay job of cleaning those up. However, ideally, especially in this day and age, you know, to get a set with the set of brand new shims in it is probably only an extra $3 or $4 on a set that doesn't include them. So do bear that in mind when you're purchasing your new pads. If you can get the new shims, that's your ideal situation. So first things first, just familiarise yourself with your new shims. You can see we've got two different types. Obviously they're sided, so you've got four of each. To do both sides of the car. So before you start, just have a look at your old carrier, take a look at the way in which they fit, and familiarise yourself. Make sure you know exactly how your new ones are going to be fitted into situ, which one goes on which side. So let's get rid of the old shims. So just repeat that and get all four out of the way. Now is your ideal opportunity to give these a bit of a clean where the shims fit. So grab your brake cleaner and give these a bit of a gentle clean up. And just be careful of these rubber boots when you're using the brake cleaner near them. You don't want to get too much of the brake cleaner onto the rubber. So next, it's always a good idea to remove and have a look at the condition of your slider pins, and also lubricate them whilst they're out as well. So we'll take a quick look at the basics of it. What you have is a metal pin, as you'll see in a second when we pull it out, and below that you can see we've got this this rubber boot, and this rubber boot goes all the way down. As you see, I turn that's the bottom of the rubber boot there. So to release this, all you do is just literally pull it out and it will pop off like so. And then likewise, to remove the boot, just give it a bit of a twist and try and remember which end went on which end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place that down in that direction, so I know they went through in that direction. So now we'll inspect the condition of the pin and the fixings, and then we'll lubricate it and get it back together. So let's start by getting rid of some of this old grease. This is actually a very nice looking pin. It's nice and shiny and new. Either this caliper's been replaced in the not too distant past, or they've fitted new slider pins. These are in really good condition. Now, the basis of what we have here on the slider pin, that rubber boot, the lip of it sits in this little groove just under the head here. So when you pop this off, you want to make sure that there's no kind of corrosion or gunk or anything that's built up in there. If there is, you can get a flathead screwdriver and just start to get as much of that stuff out as you can. And then once you're happy with it, that it's looking good, give the whole thing a quick blast with the brake cleaner, and so it's nice and clean and ready to refit. And then we'll look at the other elements. So the next thing to look at is, again, the other end of that rubber boot sits into this lip right here. So again, you want to visually inspect that, and if you can see any corrosion or crud or dirt in there, just get off as much as you can, and then give that a wipe over with some brake cleaner. When you do the brake cleaner on this side, don't spray it into the hole, spray it onto your rag, and then use your thumb to work it in around the edge there. And next, grab your torch, shine it in, and kind of look down it and visually inspect it. This one looks like it had a good seal on it, so I'm not expecting to see any contaminants in there. If you can see anything that looks unusual, any particles, any bits of rust, anything at all, that needs to be cleaned out. This one's not. This one's actually looking pretty good, again, because it had a nice seal to begin with. If you do want to give it a clean, and finally, just take a look inside your rubber boot here, and again, you're looking for any contaminants, crumbs, bits of rubbish that shouldn't be in there. If this holds a good seal, which this one looks to have because it was very clean around the edges on both the pin and on the carrier side, then it's highly likely that this has been successful in stopping dirt and water and things like that getting in there. So, but always worth double checking, because that's a good telltale sign. Sometimes they can be full of rubbish if you've had a bad seal. So next up, we're going to apply some grease to the pin before it gets refitted. Now, the grease that you can either use your kind of dedicated brake grease product, as we'll be using in just a minute, but I actually prefer, and again, this is just personal choice, moly grease, which is a lithium-based grease, and this is designed for things such as this, and for things like CV joints, where you've got kind of a metal on metal, and also rubber boots and things of that nature. It doesn't degrade the rubber, so this is a really good grease to use. But you know, if you haven't got 2 or 3 greases to hand, as we've been using in this video, you know, you can go ahead and just use your standard dedicated brake grease. So just apply a little bit in towards the end. Just want to get a nice seal as this comes up. Give that a bit of a twist. There. Squeeze out the excess. That should give us a nice seal there. And you want to pull this back as far as you can. Get it in behind the rubber boot if you can. You're going to be fairly generous with it, but not too much. Like so, and then we'll just slide that back in. And what you'll find is you have the grease, the excess kind of grease will spill out. That's absolutely fine. We'll wipe that off in just a second. So what we're going to do is just give it a bit of a push and a twist, and see that's popped back on. So I'm just going to wipe away the excess. If you give that a bit of a twist, that will allow you to wipe the excess off, but also ensure that you get a good seal. So that's kind of the key to the slider pins, really, is making sure that you get a good seal on both of the ends there. So of course what you want to do is repeat exactly the same process on your other pin. So when you're fitting your new shims, you just want to make sure that they fit in nice and tight. There shouldn't be a gap between the shim and the carrier bracket there. So again, in nice and tight, and no noticeable gap in there. So now we're going to be using the dedicated brake grease. Hundreds of companies make this kind of product, but this is what you want to look for, a brake grease. You can also do the kind of work that we're just about to do in the copper grease, in the copper slip. But that's kind of a slightly old-fashioned way of doing it. A lot of people don't rate that product anymore, even though a lot of garages still use it, and they prefer to use a dedicated brake grease product such as this. This is easily available. Any automotive store will stock this, but this is the best stuff. Ignore the brand, but a dedicated brake grease is the best stuff to do the type of work that we're about to do. So what we want to do first is just to apply a thin layer of the grease just to the insides of these shims. Simple as that. Make sure that it goes into the corners. Make sure you've actually pushed it into the corners. You want to do that on all four of those. So next, carefully put your carrier back into situ and start to get both of the bolts done back up. So next up, grab your torque wrench, and we're going to torque these up to the factory spec, which on the Dodge Grand Caravan we have here is 169 Newton meters, which is 125 foot-pounds. So here are the new pads. Obviously we've got two pairs, so I'll stick one pair back in the box for use on the other side. So here is the brand new pair of pads. As we can see, as we mentioned there earlier, we've got the wear kind of sensor, if you like, the manual wear sensor. That will start to screech as soon as it gets to that level there, which is the minimum these pads should ever be run to. So let's look at getting these fitted. And remember, before you handle these pads, you should change your gloves or clean your gloves, which I've just done, because you don't want to be rubbing any grease into the face of these pads, because these are actually slightly absorbent. And so if you put grease in there, it'll actually soak in, and it's going to take a while to come out. And obviously that's going to massively reduce the efficiency of these and make it dangerous. So you don't want to be getting any grease onto the face of these pads. Now I'm going to add some of my brake grease to these. around the ears on the side here, and I also still like to put a little bit on the backing. It's not as essential as it used to be back in the olden days. So as you can see, they come with these special additional backing plates which help things stop sticking together. But we're going to add a little bit of it on there as well, which is kind of an optional stage. You don't have to if your pads have got this this proper kind of backing as these have, but still a nice thing to do, just as an additional feature if you want to. So again, being careful not to touch the grease on the pads here. What we want to do is get these fed inside the ears, top and bottom. Just make sure that they travel nice and freely. This is why you apply the grease. So the next stage, before we can refit the caliper over the new brake pads, obviously our brand new brake pads, they're nice and thick and chunky, and so it's not all going to fit into this little gap anymore. So what we need to do is we actually need to retract the piston of this caliper back into the body of the caliper. Now, a couple of things to note before we retract it is this one has come out a particularly long way because the brake pads were so thin, they were much thinner than they should have been. So this is kind of at its maximum. And as you can see, it has a rubber boot, and the rubber boot sits in a groove, and it's not quite sitting in it because it's kind of pulled it to its maximum. So when this goes back in a little bit, it should, hopefully the boot should fit back in its groove a little bit better. Before we push it back in, especially as we know that the boot has kind of broken its seal, what you want to do is just push it back a little bit and have a little look. So what you don't want is too much kind of dirt and grime on the inside there. So what I might do just before I retract this back into the body there, I'll just get some brake cleaner, being very careful not to apply the brake cleaner to the rubber. So I'm going to put it on some blue paper, put some brake cleaner on. I'm just going to clean this up a little bit before we retract that back into the caliper. So next we need to push the piston back, and you're going to need some kind of retraction tool. There are various different types that you can get. This is actually a caliper spreader, but this type of tool can still be used in that manner, and then you just unscrew that and that will slowly start to push that back in. You also get versions of this where half of it looks like almost like a brake pad. That sits in there. It's got one that goes straight through the middle into the centre of the piston, and you just screw it through in that manner. We're going to use a proper brake rewind set. We're going to use the front caliper tool from the brake rewind set, which is kind of the best way of doing these if you have them available. And one of these sets is probably about $30, and obviously it will last. It'll last forever, and is a very worthwhile investment if you intend to do a lot of work on your own brakes. There you go, and now you can see that the boot's fitting back on perfectly because the rubber's not so stretched. So we can see that piston is slowly, step by step, retracting back into the body of the caliper. You shouldn't need to force it, it should be relatively smooth to do this. See, I'm just doing it with one hand. It should be relatively easy, and just carry on until you feel it stop, and don't force it any further. So now you should have enough space to just slide your caliper into a position. So next up, just take your remaining bolts, just get these aligned. And do the same on the bottom. One quick thing to note as well, so these particular ones have never had any nut lock on there. If they had, you'd see like a blue line or smear around the end of the bolt. If you remove yours, it depends on the make and model of the car. So some require it, some don't. If you see that yours has got blue on it, you will need a little bit of nut lock, and just put a tiny little blob just on one side, and then as you put it in and twist it, that will work its way in around the thread. And all that's designed to do is just to stop the unlikely occurrence of that bolt ever kind of rattling itself loose. So it's an additional safety measure. So again, grab the torque wrench, and we're going to torque these up to 35 Newton meters, which is 26 foot-pounds. Okay, so one final optional stage. What you can do is you can apply some of your copper grease, your copper anti-seize, to the face of the disc and around the remaining section of the hub right here. If you've ever had a wheel that's stuck on, you've struggled to get the wheel off, this is the way to help resolve that issue, and that can be a real problem. One of the rear wheels on this particular car took us about 15 minutes to get off. It was a nightmare. So again, a little tip for you, this is completely optional, but this is something we like to do just to stop the any corrosion between the back of the wheel and the front of the disc face. And you just want a very thin coating, and obviously it only goes on this centre section, not the outer section, which is the actual braking surface. Just a nice thin layer of it, and just work that all the way around. Be careful not to get any on the actual face of the rotor there. Once you've got the wheel nuts finger tight, before we lower it down to the ground, I'm just going to get them a little bit tighter. And when you tighten them, don't go around in a circle. What you want to do is a star pattern, so you want to go from where you are to directly the opposite side. So you've got to do the same on this one here. And then again, directly to the opposite side, directly to the opposite side, directly to the opposite side. So you're actually drawing a kind of a star pattern as you go round. That will allow you to tighten them evenly, whereas opposed to going around in a circle, obviously you won't. Next, we're going to grab your torque wrench again and set it to 138 Newton meters, which is 102 foot-pounds. And just torque each of your wheel nuts up. And again, following that star pattern, so not going around in a circle from here directly to opposite, and then that one, that one, that one. So that's it, guys. Your brake job is now complete. Now, before you jump in your car and shoot down the motorway at 70 miles an hour, what you want to do is hop into your car and test the brake pedal. Make sure that it feels nice and firm, and take any slack out of that brake pedal that's been created by pushing the pistons back in. So when you first press it, it might be a bit spongy because you're pressing those pistons back out, taking up the slack. So once the slack's taken out, that brake pedal should feel nice and solid. Assuming that it does, what you want to do is just roll your car backwards and forwards a few times just outside your house and test those brakes at very low speed. Again, make sure that they're tight and they feel correct. If they do, take your car for a very short drive, not on the highway, at low speed. Again, test those brakes, and then if you're good to go, you can go on and drive them as normal. So that's it, guys. I hope this has been useful for you. If it has, please support us here at U-Wrench by both liking, giving us the thumbs up, the like on this video, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it, and we'll see you in the future on another video.